Good afternoon. I'm
Hi,
sitting here with James Song. He, we met him because he was our corporate lawyer when we sold our business. James, would you like to introduce yourself?
absolutely. I'm James Song. I'm a lawyer in the city of Edmonton and have practiced for roughly 30 years and have had the great advantage of having worked with lots of great clients, including the person you're seeing on screen right now. And we've had lots of fun in bringing people through deals and towards deals and then finalizing them for sure.
Yeah, that's great. So you really do specialize in the corporate side of law. We got involved when we were selling our practice, and I don't know if our sale was typical or not. You're the only one in this room that could tell us that. And if it wasn't typical, what wasn't typical about it? And if it was, what was typical?
Yeah, in the sense that you have a seller and a buyer of a business and they both want that deal to proceed. I think a lot of times what you're seeing is there can be a slight disconnect on certain pieces of it. But most deals proceed initially by way of some kind of letter of intent. And whether it's a share sale or an asset sale, those considerations are important, obviously, for tax. But what I think is even more important is kind of how the client comes to the transaction, if they're prepared for it, and if they know what kind of information they need in order to be fully prepared to close those deals. Now, once in a while, you'll see a seller or a buyer will hit a little snag or a bump in the road that makes it either harder to proceed or the deal may have to be sort of rejigged and reconfigured to sort of meet the new demands of the information that they get. But I find a lot of times in commercial transactions, a lot of it is about disclosure and who sees what and who's provided with what. And I think the earlier that disclosure happens, the more effective everybody is in the process.
So, from a seller's point of view, what what could really blow up the deal at the last minute?
Right. So things that can blow up the deal in the last minute can be things like changes in sort of the macroeconomic spheres. So certainly COVID showed us that that can derail something. If there's a massive change in interest rates, certainly you might have a buyer that qualifies on a purchase price with a particular percentage, and then their interest rate increases so much that they might not be able to finalize it if the rate hasn't been fixed. There are some things like that. Uh, Outside of that, those kinds of factors, you might be looking at contracts that might not have been disclosed. There might be certain supplier agreements. Sometimes people get hung up on leases because the leases are different than what was provided for in the original disclosure. And so I would say it's sort of like you have to be prepared for the things you're not going to be prepared for, which is sort of hard to fathom or account for. But things often change in the course of a deal. And I think we just have to be flexible. And if both parties are on board, usually the deal does get closed, even if there are certain amendments to it.
I can attest to that. I remember asking James in December, I want to go on a holiday. Is that okay? We're just going to go on holidays. This is all done, right? And he said, yeah, it's all done except for the signing. Go on your holiday. Didn't take a laptop with us. My advice to anybody selling or buying and you're on a holiday, take that laptop. It was not fun trying to put the whole thing back together on a couple of cell phones, but it was doable. And the reason I think it was doable for my partner and myself was James in his office would just be like, okay, just tell us what you want. And they would magically put that into legalese and bring it back to us. And I could not imagine doing this without the team that we had working for us. And we thought we had it all hammered out. And I don't even know what sort of went sideways, but all of a sudden, I just think personally, I thought too many lawyers got their fingers in the pie and went, we need a summer home. But I know that's not the case, but it kind of felt like that.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting is typically you've got one lawyer to represent one particular interest. And so the seller and the buyer each have a different person for obvious reasons of conflict of interest. It's really hard to represent somebody if you're kind of trying to figure out what the other guy needs more than your own client. At the same time, there's sometimes a separate owner lawyer for the leasing company or a landlord. So there can be different things happening there. And I think we saw that on Linda's matter. The good news is that when you have a client that actually listens to what you're trying to tell them. And when you have a client that actually understands the material that they're being provided with, it makes it a lot easier. And I wouldn't say that everybody understands everything that they're getting in their inbox. So having those conversations early and often is really key. And I think the whole point about client legal counsel communication is so critical, because no matter what stage we were at, we always felt that we could pick up the phone and say, okay, Linda, this is what's going on. And you would give us some thoughtful responses to those questions.
Well, that's not quite how it went, James. You'd pick up the phone and say, Linda, this is what's going on. And I'd go, Robin, do you know what he's talking about? Is he talking English? And then I'd unmute the phone and I'd say, oh, yeah, sure, no problem.
You guys did quite well. And you're, in a lot of ways, those are the clients we love to work with, right? People that have a little bit of intellectual curiosity, but also know kind of how they'd like the deal to proceed, because so much of it is mapping out something that you've already been thinking about.
Right.
It isn't really for the lawyers to quote unquote make the deal. It's for them to sort of preserve the deal. So in other words, it's like you throw the ball to us, and then it's kind of our job not to drop it. And I think that's really where it kind of becomes really important. I think the most effective legal advice is the advice that gets you to the finish line. And I think that's always true.
I completely agree. I mean, if you hadn't have been making those phone calls when we were on holidays, we wouldn't have gotten to the finish line, because for whatever reason, it just sort of stalled. Now, we used a broker, a business broker, when we sold. Does that make your job easier, about the same?
It depends. I think the brokerage is really essential to creating the setup in the first place. So the broker usually makes the introduction, kind of in legal real estate terms, they'd be kind of like a realtor of some kind. And that business broker introduces everybody, gets the information out. I think once they've done their job, though, it's really important that they step back and let the other people sort of take over, so that they're not. It's sort of like a stay in your lane kind of thing. So once the deal has become unconditional, and the buyer and seller know it's going forward, the broker should sort of step out unless there's information that they have that could assist in the process. And that can be really hard sometimes for them to do, because they're so invested in the outcome. But I would suggest generally that it's a good thing when they're involved. Having said that, I think it's important that they just know when it's time to step off and let other people take over.
Right. I know for us, it just made it so seamless that, the broker did it to this point, and then it got handed over to the legal team, and went very well. So what would be 3 things that somebody that is thinking about buying a business should know or should do before they actually go ahead with them?
Sure. Number one, ask the seller for a lot of transparency. In other words, ask them for the information you need, and don't be shy about it. Go right up and say, look, I need X, Y, Z before I could even consider this thing. That's number one. Number two, make sure that you have access to financing, unless you have the cash, which one or two people will have, but most people are going to get financing on a commercial deal. So make sure you have the bank on board. You've talked to your banker about what type of business you want. And if this particular one falls into your lap, that's the one you're going to get the approvals on. So have the banker lined up in advance and have as much information to them as you can, as quickly as you can. And then the third thing I would say to buyers is understand that the people that are on your side, on your team, are on your team. Not only are you paying them, but that they're sort of seasoned sort of experts in their area. So make sure you resource them as much as possible and get the best sort of utilization of those resources. And that ties into sort of 3B, which is make sure this is a business you want. I think it's really underrated in terms of the passion piece. I think if you have passion and a lot of engagement with the business that you're going to acquire, it makes you a better business owner. Certainly there are people who've bought businesses that they've had to learn from scratch, but I think at least have that interest in it, and at least have that passion as an owner, because there's a lot of pride in ownership, but there's also a lot of potential risks of business ownership. And so I think when the going gets tough, you definitely want to be in a position where you really like what you're doing and you're really passionate about it.
Yeah. And I really agree with that. And I think one of the things that happened with ours that made it sort of have to be reworked a little bit was about that whole financing bit. The banks couldn't make the deadlines, and so everything had to be extended. And in fairness to the lawyers, we're just like, oh, just make it happen. We'll just initial here. And they're like, oh, no, you're not doing that, right? And on both sides, they were saying that. I'm not saying that it was only on our side that that was happening. I know that the buyer's lawyer was just as emphatic about this has to be redone. You can't just take this and, make a few changes at that point.
I would agree. And also the reporting that goes out to you. And so as part of that documentation package, it's not just paperwork in the same way that a marriage certificate is more than just a piece of paper. This document will be used by your accountant during filing for the CRA returns for the year, for financial statements going forward, for valuation pieces. There's a lot of things that follow that closing and that transaction report. And so I can't emphasize enough that it's really important that you get the documentation related to that investment. Now, on your side, you were selling and somebody was buying it from you. But even on the seller's side, is there a capital gain to pay? Are there other deductions that can be made? There's all sorts of things to consider. And a lot of that initial information will come from your legal counsel as the deal closes.
Right. And I know you were really interested in making sure who owned what shares in the company, what percentages, what kinds of shares. If you don't have that information available to you, could that sour a whole deal that all of a sudden you come up with more shareholders than you originally, the broker or whoever put the deal together, thought?
Well, it's possible. And again, it's getting the information early and often. I think part of it is that the reason why we're so uptight about getting the right information at the beginning is to make sure that there isn't another shareholder that's sort of been forgotten in the documentation. So let's say you have two people that own the shares on the surface, but there's a third shareholder that lives in Texas and nobody's talked to her for 10 years. We have to account for that person. And so for all sorts of reasons, we want to make sure that, it's basic stuff, right? Color in the lines. Who are the owners and will they be able to sign the documentation? I'd suggest that a lot of what we do, and there's technical pieces too, but the questions are very simple, right? Who are the owners? Are they ready to sell? What's the price? What's the closing? And are there any wrinkles in the deal? And I think what's really boring is like a really straightforward deal. I always think that's a bit dull. It's always fun to see something a little bit out of the box, and you have to account for it. And I think that's sometimes where the creativity and problem solving comes in, because like everybody else, lawyers like to be engaged. And so if I can be engaged, obviously we loved you as clients, you're great people, but also engaged in the work that we're doing on that file, it's even better.
Yeah. Well, I know I had an excellent experience with your firm, not just with you, but everybody in your firm that we dealt with. They were more than helpful, more than we could ever hope for helpful.
That's so kind. We appreciate that so much.
No, we could not have done this without you folks. Absolutely. Lawyers sometimes get a bad rap, but not in this case.
That's awesome. We love to hear that.
And is there any other, like, we were the sellers, anything that, like, we talked about what a buyer could do, are the things that a seller could do to make life easier in the process too?
Yeah, I think aside from disclosure, maybe having a few conversations ahead of time. I know that a lot of times the broker or the person that introduces the parties don't necessarily have them at dinner together chatting the whole time. But I think there's some value in having the seller and buyer talk to each other, just in terms of what will training look like, how long will the transition be, what are the strengths relatively of the employees that we're taking over. I think those are really nice things to have conversations about. And I think the more you do that, the less surprises there are later. But I will say in these types of transactions, and we did quite a few of them, there's always something that kind of comes out of the woodwork, but it's rarely fatal. It's something that's sort of like, well, that's interesting. Yeah, let me account for that. And so the fewer surprises, I would say, the better. Surprises are great for birthday parties. They're terrible for legal deals. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we've talked about buying and selling a business. What else does a corporate lawyer do? Like, what else does your firm do?
Yeah, so we would do incorporation, so the starting up of the company itself. We would handle financing work so that if a company gets to a certain size, then it decides it's going to borrow money, we help the company deal with the bank on that basis. And then we also do a lot of sort of repair work, especially if you're getting to the point where a company's been in place for years, but now it's time to divest. And it's got lots of shareholders. We handle the sort of getting ready for that departure point. I would say that one of the trends that's starting to happen now, and Linda, you see this as well, is that we're seeing a lot of companies get to a critical mass where a lot of the founders are retirement age, and so they're looking to get out of the business and to take their equity out. And so we're seeing a lot of sometimes in-family transfers, sometimes third-party transfers. Sometimes we're looking at buyers who are coming in from outside of the country to acquire a company that has a unique product or intellectual property. So there's a lot going on in the Alberta market, and that's why I think it's really important for us to educate the clients as much as possible what they can expect as they get closer and closer to those times.
And the other time that I often wished clients would have looked at their files a little bit closer and their corporate structure is when you have clients that were terminally ill, and we'd be saying to them, have you talked to your lawyer? What are you doing with your shares? Oh, it's in my will. That's not the best approach, is it, James?
Yeah, it may or may not be depending on how their corporation is set up. And so clearly, if an asset is personal in nature, it will transfer by virtue of the will or by joint ownership, depending on the situation. But when you're getting into a situation where there might be corporate ownership, there may be an existing shareholder agreement that doesn't allow those shares to go by virtue of the will. So it can be a little tricky. And so reviewing that whole scenario is really critical. I think that clients have come a long way, and in our society, we've come a long way in terms of talking about things like end of life, retirement, sort of the piece where you kind of get back out. And I think we're more comfortable with it. So I think the conversations are starting to happen, but it's still a very sensitive chat for some people, just by nature of the fact that it's not always, easy to have those chats with folks.
Well, and I think a lot of times it's not easy to even know what you want to do. If you have 4 children and you had a T4 job your whole life, it's like, well, I'm just going to split all my assets equally between my 4 children or whatever. But
Right.
when you maybe have a child that's worked in your business with you for the last 50 years, would that business even be there without that child? But there's 3 other children that aren't involved in that business. And so I think sometimes it's just easier not to do anything than it is to try to work through that. Do you give that kind of advice to people, or where would you send them to get that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that sort of long-term estate planning advice, we do some of that here. Obviously, when it becomes tax-driven, we'd either ask folks like you or tax lawyers to assist in the planning piece. But because each company and each family is different, we like to structure it depending on what their specific needs are. But I think the most complicated scenario is a business owner who has a lot of personal assets, but also has a bunch of corporate assets, which may or may not be owned with family. And I think when you start hitting those points, most folks should understand that they have to talk to somebody and sort of bring those subjects together in a way that makes sense for their estate. And you're not really doing it for you per se. I mean, obviously, if someone passes, that they're not there to deal with that specific item, but it really is a benefit to the family members that you leave behind, and also the tax position you're going to be in, because you may be able to take advantage of certain lifetime capital gains exemptions and other things that our RCAs and CPAs will advise us on. So absolutely critical. One of the other pieces I should say too is that lawyers should work very closely also with accountants, because we're parallel professions, and so the things that accountants are doing we don't know as much about, and sometimes the reverse is true. So what we're really trying to do is to get everybody on the same page to maximize the benefit to that client, and that really should be our goal.
Yes. I do say that your office was amazing at that. Like it just really seemed very seamless when we were dealing with you folks.
Yeah. Well, thank
Would
you.
you?
And we enjoyed dealing with you. Trust me, you guys were fantastic.
Well, yeah, you just never knew what was going to come out of our mouths, but that's okay. Yeah. Do you have any words of wisdom before we say goodbye today?
Well, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to talk to your audience, and also that we had a great time working with you, and I think that knowledge is a benefit. And so if people understand what they're getting into, ask the questions. You know, they always say that there are no dumb questions, but there are some dumb answers. And so ask the question and make sure that the person you're talking to has that expertise. But and also when you're looking for a lawyer, when you're looking for an accountant or any other professional, kind of interview them, you know, like call them, talk to them, get a sense of who they are. I know that you guys spoke to us and we had some interactions before I think we got hired. So that's always a great idea to make sure it's a good fit and that you're going to work well with these folks.
Yes, and when we were looking for a lawyer, we actually went to a personal lawyer that Robin had had contact with and a good respect for, and he referred us to James. So even though you may not know somebody, you don't always have to go to the phone book. Ask around. A referral from someone you know is worth 10 names in the phone book, I always say. And I don't know
Well
if you
said.
can find a phone book now, but Google, I guess.
It's
Okay, I'm old.
that's one way of doing it. Yeah. And I think that's actually great advice because you're right. A referral from a friend who's done this type of thing before with that person definitely helps cut through some of that red tape for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. James, would you come back and talk to us again?
Anytime, anywhere. Just enjoyed this very much.
This would be awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure.
We'll have James' contact information available shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Take care.